Okay, so we're going to pick up with biological aspects of personality. Um, Welcome to Washington, D.C. Um, I'm down here and I figured I would welcome you from afar. All right, so in chapter 4, we mentioned that the neo-analytic perspective ignored some of the biological aspects of personality. So it makes sense that chapter 5 would continue with these components. All right. So the way this chapter is divided is we're going to talk about direct genetic effects and indirect effects of biology. So when we talk about direct genetic effects, we are going to talk about naturalistic selection and functionalism. So natural selection refers to the adaptive or functional characteristics that have been reinforced over generations. Um, Naturally, each person is different, and it looks at the function of behavior for survival. When we think about this, I think it's important to note that only the things that promote survival are supposed to be passed on. What happens when we have psychological disorders? What happens when we have personality problems? This is when genetic factors get passed on that are maladaptive. All right. So the next concept is evolutionary personality theory, and the purpose of this concept is to apply evolution to personality. And ultimately, these characteristics include behavioral tendencies and emotions, and that's what we call personality from a biological perspective. Now, there are a series of disorders that are worthwhile talking about that influence our character, influence the way we behave. So, the first of which is Angelman syndrome. And in Angelman syndrome, these children are typically unusually happy. They're typically their face, they appear very attractive. However, if you were to do a psychological assessment, they typically suffer from mental retardation or what we call intellectual disability today. They typically have rigid movements and they typically have sleep abnormalities in which they sleep less than other children. Now, one of the most important things about Angelman syndrome is it highlights how genetics influence personality. The second thing I'm going to talk to you about is called Williams syndrome. Williams syndrome, once again, we're talking about a person with mental retardation or an intellectual disability. Yet, when we look at their mannerisms, they're very social. They will greet you, they'll say hello, yet cognitively there are deficits. So they have physical and developmental abnormalities, but they're pretty social. Now, I'm going to skip the video, and when I see you on Friday, I'll show you the video. But this video was on Williams syndrome, and it's such a good video that remind me on Friday to show it to you. But it highlights, how these children can't do basic tasks. Yet, when it comes to speaking to a person, they're, very, very social and engaging. All right. So, behavioral genomics. This is a new area of study that examines the relation between genes and behavior. It comes out of the Human Genome Project. If I were to ask you how many distinct genes does a person have, most of you, without any past knowledge, would probably say in the millions. And ultimately, that's not correct. There's roughly 25 to 30,000 distinct genes. And that's pretty cool because when we look at genetic disorders, most people didn't want to study it because they felt like there were so many genetic combinations that they'll never identify a genetic disorder. They'll never be able to treat genetic disorders. But the Human Genome Project, which is pretty much from the 1990s, identified 25 to 30,000 distinct genes. And since then, we've been able to identify I want to say something like 7,000 genetic-based disorders, and we've been able to treat many of them. So behavioral genomics has come a long way. All right. The other piece that I want to talk to you about is behavioral genetics, and that looks at how biology influences behavior. Now, you could look at it in several different ways. One way is a quantitative approach, and that is to look at the degree of nature and nurture in twin studies. I'll talk to you about the Minnesota twin studies as we go. Or we could look at the molecular genetics, which are the products and correlates of a given gene. Now, when we look at psychological disorders and personality factors, it's important that I highlight that there's something called a polygenetic inheritance, which is to say that there are typically not one gene driving a personality factor or a psychological disorder. There are many factors. All right, now, core functions like sex, fear, and anger have a very strong genetic base. Actually, I'm going to go back a second. And psychological disorders like bipolar, antisocial personality disorder, schizophrenia, these also have strong genetic bases. So behavioral genetics we look at typically. All right. Now, temperament. So what is temperament? Temperament is your stable individual differences in emotional reactivity. Temperament is typically viewed as a biological predisposition for emotional reactivity. I like to describe temperament as how long or how short, or how long, better yet, your fuse is. Those people who are emotionally reactive, they're wired that way, and those people are cool and calm and collected, typically are wired that way. Now, if we look at longitudinal studies in temperament, we typically see that temperament is pretty stable. The research goes as early as 3 years old. We can see temperament is pretty much locked in. And another cool thing that we see is that temperament is pretty stable in both humans and animals. I think in chapter 1 I talked to you about personality as it relates to animals. And animals have distinct personalities and they have distinct temperaments, and the research seems to support that. Okay, now in terms of temperament, there are 4 basic aspects of temperament. There's activity, emotionality, sociability, and aggression. So activity refers to either vigorous versus passive motion. So how engaged you are. Emotionality, which I talk to you as the long fuse or the short fuse, that refers to how emotionally reactive you are. Sociability refers to the degree to which people approach or interact with people. You might want to refer to this as the introversion extroversion factor as it relates to biological basis. And then we talked about aggression and impulsivity. This is the degree by which a child is aggressive and cold as opposed to conscientious and warm. And as I mentioned, we can see this as early as 3 years old. So temperament plays a notable role. Okay. Now, theories of personality. Eysenck's model of nervous system temperament is what I want you to know. Eysenck has what I refer to as the 3-factor model of personality. We might talk about him again when we get to trait theory because of the big 5 and 16 factors. But Eysenck has the 3 factors. And ultimately, what are the 3 factors? There's introversion versus extroversion. There's neuroticism, and then there's psychoticism. Eysenck started with 2 factors, and he recognized that psychoticism was its own factor. So he separated neuroticism and psychoticism. All right, but let's go one by one. Introversion versus extroversion. Let's take a look at it. This is based on your book. I don't necessarily agree with the definition. But your book talks about introverts as being generally shy and reserved. I embrace the fact that introverts are reserved, but I'm not sure, based on more modern research, whether introverts should be viewed as shy. All right, now, introverts typically have higher levels of internal arousal, therefore, they seek external stimulation much less. So they have this internal baseline of arousal that's higher. All right, now, is this true? Is this more speculation? Ultimately, when we look at EEG studies, which measures firing in the brain, we see that introverts have greater levels of arousal. All right, what about extroverts then? Extroverts are more active, sociable, and outgoing. I embrace that definition as it is. Neuroscience looks at this, and typically they have lower levels of internal arousal. And because they have lower levels of internal arousal, they seek out external stimulation. So if we go back to Carl Jung and Carl Jung's concept of an introvert and an extrovert, an introvert turns their processing inward, and extrovert turns their processing outward. And I talked about an introvert would seek, less social companionship and whatnot. So this is actually consistent, but now we're explaining it on a biological level. All right. Now, introversion, extroversion, we can see this in the ARAS. Now, ARAS is an acronym. It stands for Ascending Reticular Activating System. That's in the brainstem. We measure, and ultimately extroverts have lower internal levels of arousal. All right. Now, neuroticism, emotionality, this is a second component. So people who are stable, they tend to have well-modulated nervous systems, whereas a person who's neurotic, I like to say they're more anxiety prone. Now, I mentioned that Eysenck's model. There's a third factor. It's not on the PowerPoint slide. Psychoticism. There's a difference between an anxiety base of psychological problems, and psychoticism, where it's more of a detachment from reality. Eysenck embraces that as well. Now, so when we look at this three-factor model, there are problems with it. One is it's difficult to define and measure arousal. So what do we mean by levels of arousal? We arbitrarily defined it as EEG firing and activity in the reticular formation, or ARAS. But it's hard to define what we mean by ARAS. Another thing is that when we look at these theories, it's problematic because ultimately all people seek equilibrium. All people seek balance, and many problems occur because the body ultimately seeks equilibrium. All right. The next model which I want to introduce you to is Jeffrey Gray's BIS and BAS. The behavioral inhibition system guides our tendency to avoid punishing situations, and a biological activating system regulates our response to rewards. And I'm not sure those of you who remember this, but maybe you learned about Edward Thorndike and Thorndike's law of effect, which suggests that we seek pleasure and avoid pain. This is also referred to as the law of adaptive hedonism. So Jeffrey Gray talks about the BIS and BAS. So let's look at it. As I mentioned, the behavioral inhibition system, also known as the BIS, guides our tendency to avoid punishing situations. Too much activity in the BIS results in anxiety. This is consistent with biological sciences. Now, when we look at the BAS, which stands for the biological activating or activation system, this regulates our reward. Now, too much activation in the BAS results in impulsivity. Can anyone think of a problem that is a function of perhaps reward seeking or overactive pleasure seeking? And usually it's tied to impulsivity as well. I'll let you think about that. Give you a moment or two. If you came to the concept of addictions, you would be correct. So addictions would be tied to an overactive biological activation system, or BAS. Okay, another thing is that we talk about pleasure seekers or sensation seekers or thrill seeking personality. You may have heard it described different ways, but sensation seekers are those who are drawn to novel and exciting experiences. And this is Zuckerman's theory, and Zuckerman posits that those people are high on sensation seeking are driven by lower levels of internal arousal. It's consistent with what we've said with Jeffrey Gray. So because you have lower levels of internal arousal, you need to go out of your way to get these external stimulation. So extreme things like drag racing. So I live in Staten Island, and there's a strip of roadway called Highland Boulevard, and people drag race on Highland Boulevard. Typically, they're people your age, teenagers, early adulthood, and it's the rush of racing and beating their friend. There's one problem. That drag racing, ultimately, people lose control of the car, and every year in Staten Island, you open the Staten Island Advance and you read the newspaper, and people wrap their car around telephone poles and they pass away. So this is sensation seeking that goes awry. Other sensation seeking might be skydiving. In full disclosure, I went skydiving once, and I would only do it once. This was for a family member's birthday. They asked me to go, and as a birthday gift to them, I went. I had a good time. I really enjoyed it, but I'm more conservative, to be honest with you, and I value my life. I wouldn't want to risk my life doing it again. All right, so that would be a sensation seeker. Other sensation seeking might be a polar bear club, where people want to dive in frigid cold water, or they might want to go on a trail in the wilderness and leave their family for months at a time. This could be sensation seeking. All right, what do all these things have in common? Whether it's substance abuse, whether it's skydiving, whether it's hiking or polar bear, they all have in common that people are seeking external arousal. They're seeking arousal from their environment. Okay. So let's continue. When I talk about sensation seeking, I mentioned that it can be tied to addiction or addiction proneness. This should not shock you that there's something called the mesolimbic dopamine system. And the mesolimbic dopamine system is the pleasure pathway in the brain. Now, pleasure pathway has all to do with sensation seeking, but it also has what to do with addiction. So if we look at it, mesolimbic. Meso is midbrain, limbic is the limbic system, dopamine. This is the point. Dopamine is a neurotransmitter tied to pleasure. And sure enough, if we look at substances of abuse, dopamine is oftentimes at play. An example that your book gives, which is quite nice, is that dopamine is tied to stimulants such as cocaine and whatnot. Now, so that's the thrill seeking, the pleasure of addiction. By the way, I just realized I have a spelling error if you look at, and I'm going to move my cursor over it, this should not say substance abuse and addition. It should say substance abuse and addiction. Now, serotonin, crud. Hold on. Serotonin also is another neurotransmitter at play here. Serotonin typically is related to impulsivity, and SSRIs decrease impulsivity. And how do they do it? They block the reuptake of serotonin. All right. Now, next slide. Why is this not moving? Brain regions. In terms of the brain regions, you could divide the brain into lobes and hemispheres. For this class, I'm only going to divide the brain into hemispheres. So if we go right down the midline of the brain, we would have the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere. And everyone has a dominant hemisphere and a non-dominant hemisphere. So the dominant hemisphere is contralateral to your writing hand. So if a person is right-handed, their dominant hemisphere would be their left hemisphere. If a person's left-handed, their dominant hemisphere would be the right hemisphere. Now, what do each hemisphere do? So I always give people a mnemonic, LL. So the left hemisphere is associated with language and logic. Now, in terms of emotions, it's associated with positive emotions. Your right hemisphere is associated with spatial organization, creativity, and negative emotions. So for our class, we want to focus more on positive versus negative emotion. Left hemisphere, positive emotion. Right hemisphere, negative emotions. Okay. Next discussion that we're going to have are on twin studies. So when we look at twin studies, we could talk about monozygotic and dizygotic twins. Monozygotic comes from the word mono being one, zygotic coming from the word zygote. So it's one fertilized egg. So we have twins from one fertilized egg. How does that work? You have one egg and it splits in half. Interesting, because identical twins, we say that they have perfect similarity in terms of genetics. And sure enough, if we look at genetic factors and disorders, identical twins are going to have higher concordance rates. Fraternal twins, on the other hand, are referred to as dizygotic. And when I say dizygotic, I'm saying di-zygotic, right? Di being two, zygotic being zygote. So you actually, this occurs when mom releases two eggs when she ovulates instead of one. Typically, mom will release one egg and it gets fertilized. In this case, she released two, and two separate sperm fertilize the two separate eggs, and then we have fraternal twins. Okay, now their genetic similarity, it's important to note, is less than identical twins. Their genetic similarity is roughly the same as siblings. Okay, so twin studies can be very helpful in highlighting genetic similarity for personality and psychological disorders. Okay, when we look at personality factors, intelligence, and things like that, we see, sure enough, twins have very similar temperaments, that's their emotional reactivity, very similar IQs, and very similar introversion and extroversion. Okay. Excuse me. When we look at twin studies, another person I want to draw your attention to is Sir Francis Galton. Now, Galton, if you want to know who he was the cousin of Charles Darwin. And Galton was interested in studying the genetic components of both intelligence and personality. And if you read up on Galton, he had what's called the anthropometric laboratory in London, and he studied all kinds of physical and emotional and psychological factors, and he felt that genetics drives you. So he was very strong in the genetics or eugenics movement. Now, eugenics was the belief that traits are passed on from parent to child. So, eminent men have eminent sons. And that was a quote from Galton. So, he believed that genetics was passed on father to son. And in terms of women's role, he kind of ignored that. So, we would say he's a benign racist. We would say he's somewhat of a sexist, but benign. He was a product of his time. In terms of ethnic differences, he felt that the upper white class was superior to ethnic minorities. And he felt that women got their eminence from whomever they married. So he actually paid his daughters to marry into the professorship. So, all right, that's that. Now, most relevant to us, oh, I'm sorry. Most relevant to us is the Minnesota Twin Study. The Minnesota Twin Study is a pretty cool study in which they studied twins that were separated at birth. And they were raised in different environments. And what the Minnesota Twin Study found was even people separated at birth and raised in different environments shared genetic similarity. And there's tons of stories you could Google it in which, a person was raised in North America, another person was raised in South America, and sure enough, they dressed the same, even their grooming habits were the same, so maybe they had similar mustaches, their romantic partners were the same, and their professions were the same. And really, what this study showed was that, people are influenced by genetics even when they're not raised in the same environment, because you could easily argue siblings choose similar habits because they're raised in the same household. If someone is raised in North America and another person is raised in South America, it's hardly reasonable to suggest that it was due to their environment. They're raised in different environments. And I think there is a cool study, cool pairing in which twins that were separated at birth, one was in Germany and one was raised in Israel. And these twins were separated at birth during World War II. And sure enough, the member of the twin who was raised in Germany he was influenced by the environment. He became part of the Nazi movement, and the other member of the twin was raised in Israel, so he became more devoted to his faith. So you're like, oh, but they don't match, right? Other than the fact that they were on two sides of the same war, when we look at their interests in life, when we look at their values, believe it or not, they shared values. So what the Minnesota Twin Study highlights is that people can be raised in different environments and genetics can still influence. All right. There is another concept that I want to introduce you to. It's called non-shared environmental variance. And these are factors in the environment that children or people experience differently. So I talked about non-shared environment in which people are the same. Non-shared environmental variances, which two people raised separately, are influenced by their environment differently. Okay. Now, twins as a source of data. Here are some issues to think about. It's still unclear how much of the similarity is genetically pre-programmed and how much is due to shared versus non-shared environment. I highlighted extremes where people are separated at birth, but the classic case, people are not separated at birth. Therefore, it's hard to parse out how much is due to being raised in the same household or versus genetics. So, most twin studies we interpret with caution. However, there are many psychological conditions and personality factors that we see twins have greater concordance rates, which means they have greater similarity than non-twins. Okay, and I already defined non-shared environmental variance. Now let's look at genetic predispositions. I mentioned earlier that there are certain psychological conditions that are genetically hardwired. One such example is schizophrenia. Schizophrenia, if you look at the likelihood of getting schizophrenia in the general population, it's somewhere between 0.7% to 1%. If you look at siblings, it's somewhere around 5%. If you look at fraternal twins, it's somewhere between 15 to 20%. And identical twins, it's somewhere around 40%. So if one twin has it, it's a 40% up to a 50% likelihood that the other twin is going to get it. Now, I said it's 40 to 50%, even with identical twins. What does that mean? What that means is that there is a genetic predisposition for schizophrenia. It doesn't mean that they're guaranteed to get it. So if you are thinking, oh no, I have schizophrenia in the family, and now I'm going to be at risk for schizophrenia, being at risk and having the disorder are two different things. So yes, you're at greater risk, but no, you're not guaranteed to have it. So we talk about it creates a genetic predisposition. Now, schizophrenia is considered a prototype, but what if I told you that borderline personality and antisocial personality disorder, the concordance rates are even higher? Borderline, did I say borderline? Scratch that. Bipolar, I think the concordance rates are something like 70 to 80% for identical twins. So even though we use schizophrenia as the prototype, there are even other disorders that have higher genetic predisposition. Now, genetic predisposition doesn't mean that it's purely genetic. That just means you're at greater risk factor. So I don't want you to overinterpret. All concordance rates are far from perfect, and because they're far from perfect, we need to look at environmental factors too. All right, so to summarize, because I said a lot, schizophrenia is genetically hardwired. If there is a genetic predisposition, doesn't guarantee you have schizophrenia. And then I mentioned that there are other conditions with higher concordance rates. But in no case is it 100% concordance rates. How about sexual identity and homosexuality? There is a debate between psychologists and sociologists whether people are born gay or not. And psychologists take the position that people are born gay. And we feel that this is one of the reasons why psychologists are extremely opposed to, therapies that force people who are gay to be straight. We're very much opposed to that. In fact, in many states, if a person tries reparative therapies, they can lose their license. So, with that being said, the basis of our fight against trying to turn someone straight is based on our research, the biological research on homosexuality. So, twin studies have shown homosexuality is linked to genetics. So we see that people have a predisposition to homosexuality. Now, just like every other issue, nothing is a perfect concordance rate. So it's nature and nurture. So those sociologists who say there are environmental factors at play too, they're right as well. Now, another thing when we look at is the brain structure and functioning. There's great research that shows that the prefrontal cortex of homosexuals functions different than heterosexuals. So there are structural differences as well. Okay, so if we were to go back to the evolutionary model, you might be thinking, how does homosexuality get propagated if homosexuals oftentimes will not have children? Now, you could answer that in vitro fertilization and adoption, they pass on their family line, at least with in vitro. But nevertheless, when we think about it, in many cases, people don't have children who are homosexual. So, from an evolutionary perspective, how might homosexuality be addressed? How do we pass on our family line? So, when we look at kin selection, that's the answer. So, just because a person is not having kids doesn't mean that the family line isn't passed on. Many people have brothers and sisters and nieces and nephews, and they continue to pass on the family line. So that's how people survive. And if there's a genetic component, even for a predisposition, then that's going to be passed on as well. Because theoretically, homosexuality should be self-correcting, right? And it should stop if people don't have children. But it's clear that anywhere from 10 to 20% of the population identify with the LGBT community. Homosexuality has not disappeared, and it hasn't disappeared since the beginning of time. So from an evolutionary point of view, this almost challenges that. So the answer that evolutionary theorists would say is kin selection. Other relatives pass on the family line. Okay. So that's direct effects. The next thing I want to talk to you about is what we refer to as mediated effects of biology. So here is how environmental factors influence you as a person. If this were a developmental class, I would be talking to you about a word called teratogens. The same way I would do it in the class, I'm going to ask you, does anyone know what the word teratogen means? And I'm going to stop and let you think about it. What does the word teratogen mean? So, some of you know, some of you remember from your 101 class, and some of you took developmental. Teratogen, really the word can be divided into two parts, teros and gene, right? Teros being a mutation or a genetic abnormality, gene being the creation of. So something creates a mutation. In this case, a teratogen in modern definition would be any harmful agent that can pass the blood-brain barrier and influence the development of a child. So in many cases, teratogens are what we refer to as mediated effects of biology, so environmental toxins. Now, does it have to be in utero? Well, teratogens are in utero, but the effect of environmental toxins goes even outside of prenatal development. So one thing we'll talk about is mercury poisoning. So poisoning in general. How many of you remember Alice in Wonderland? And there was a character in Alice in Wonderland called the Mad Hatter, right? That actually comes from the phrase mad as a hatter in which, when we look at in history, people who were in hat making factories were exposed to high levels of mercury, and that resulted in brain damage, right? And that then all of a sudden their personality changed, the way they interacted with people changed, so high levels of mercury can result in brain damage. Today, the biggest concern is with fish. There is mercury in tuna fish. So if you read some writing, they recommend eating tuna fish, I think, once a week or once every other week. You shouldn't have tuna fish too much because some tuna fish have mercury in it. Okay. Another toxin that's of interest is lead poisoning. So lead poisoning can also result in brain damage. This was a big issue in paint. So if you look at paint from the 1970s, most of them were lead-based, and they discovered that people who their kids were eating paint chips started having brain damage. So today we have latex-based paint. But lead poisoning is a real problem. It could result in brain damage as well. So it also interesting to note, most recent research suggests that lead poisoning is also associated with autism spectrum disorders. Important for you to know. Third toxin, when we talk about minerals can also be toxin. So manganese miners are exposed to the minerals in the soil, and that ultimately results in aggression and Parkinson's disease. So the first thing you're learning is that environmental toxins can affect brain development. Okay, so can your personality be influenced by physical illness? The answer is yes. So let's take a look at how biology can influence personality or mediate changes in personality. So there's something called Meniere's disease, and Meniere's disease is an inner ear infection that results in all kinds of AV hallucinations, which stands for auditory or visual hallucinations, dizziness and whatnot, and that could alter how you relate to the world. Alzheimer's disease is another one. The best example I like to draw upon is Grey's Anatomy. Most people watch it. And in the early seasons of Grey's Anatomy, it goes through Meredith's mother, who has Alzheimer's, and she has these times when she's really lucid and friendly, and then there are times when she's having a bout with Alzheimer's where she becomes very aggressive, hostile, and her whole personality shifts towards Meredith. And I thought that was a pretty good depiction of what it looks like with Alzheimer's disease. You can have personality changes, and naturally most people recognize there as memory loss with Alzheimer's. Other mediated effects of biology, there's Pick's disease and stroke. So in these cases, people can become incapacitated, they could become aggressive, they could become uncooperative, oppositional, and so forth. Drugs. Because I want to give you time to ask questions and I don't want to rush through a lecture, I'm probably going to finish, let's see, this will be the last slide, and I'll pick up afterwards on Friday from here. So drugs, whether they be legal or illegal, can impact personality. We see in terms of stimulants such as cocaine, or we see LSD, which is a hallucinogen. They can influence personality. They can influence sensation perception. So, so legal and illegal drugs can influence you. So cocaine, the research suggests, long-term use or high doses can result in hallucinations, delusions, paranoia, sensitivity to light, Parkinson-like symptoms. Now, cocaine is influencing the neurotransmitter of dopamine, so it makes sense that Parkinsonian symptoms could occur. Now, that's during intoxication. Usually, after the drug wears off, people are good, and the long-term effects of drugs are rarely tested, so it's not sure. In terms of toxicology, personality toxicology looks at the either major or minor effects of drugs on personality. So that's the negative effects of drugs. But if you were in my 217 class, I would talk to you about psychopharmacology, which is actually a cool discipline, and it started in the 1950s, in which we started to recognize the effects of drugs in treating psychological conditions. So psychopharmacology is the use of pharmaceutical drugs to treat mental illness. And here it says psychotic symptoms, but it could be anxiety-based symptoms, mood stabilization symptoms, or even psychotic symptoms. And that is where I'm going to stop. So I'm going to stop Camtasia, and that will be that. Let me stop it.